Day by day, little by little, we write the story of our lives. Join author Joe Walsh on a walk down memory lane with tenacious humans who didn't let their circumstances dictate their life and what they could become. Welcome to the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast.
Hi, today we have our Lemon Tree podcast. Today's going to be a little different. I normally interview authors with books, memoirs about courage. Today we're going to be talking about my book, The Lemon Tree, which is going to be released in a couple of weeks on Amazon. We're super excited and just here to share my story. It can be a little difficult for me to talk about, but I have my sweet dear friend, Krissa Shockey, who we're going to talk together, and she is my friend. She is my sister in Christ, and it's wonderful to have someone like Krissa to be able to interview me to talk about my book. So here we go.
I'm very excited, and thank you for asking me to be here today. It's truly an honor. I admire you. I hold you in such high regard, and just everything that the Lord's brought you through, and which is the whole reason why we're here, why Lemon Tree is going to be hugely successful, and what the Lord's going to do through that. So just to get started with kind of the background of why you wrote the book, what was your vision in wanting to write the book?
My book is called The Lemon Tree. The Lemon Tree was actually a little store in New Orleans that I would go to as a little girl. I ride my bike over to this little store. I grew up in a very dysfunctional home, but it was going to the Lemon Tree. I found this little shop, and the owner of the shop was a very sweet businesswoman who befriended me, was kind to me. I never shared to my family about going to the Lemon Tree, but it was that owner of that store that gave me hope. And the whole message is there is always light. No matter how dark your circumstance can be, God is always there. There is always light. There's always someone that gives you hope for a future. And my whole message is that we can be a lemon tree. There's always somebody out there that could use a word of encouragement, a smile, a simple hello, how are you? You look pretty today. Something so simple can make all the difference in someone's life, and I'm a true testament of that. So. Because
that's what, in starting to read the book and getting kind of knee deep in everything in the book, that's what the shop owner, that's what she was for you, and that she was the lemon tree for you. And she just showed all of that hope, and that was your safe place during all the turmoil that we'll kind of talk about in just a little bit. So tell me about your childhood. I know you just said you kind of grew up in a dysfunctional home. Give us some more details to that.
I grew up, my mother was a singer. She was a professional singer in the Christian circuit. So she sang at churches, women's events, theater productions, and she was very well known in Dallas and New Orleans. And people held her voice in such high regard. She was an opera singer, a contralto, and she was almost like, at the time, kind of the Christian Judy Garland of New Orleans. Okay. And my grandmother, her mother, was her accompanist on the piano. She made her clothes. I mean, my grandmother was really kind of the stage mom of my mother before there was such a thing as a stage mom. My dad grew up in a very strict home as well, grew up in a home of medical professionals, and he had no interest in medicine. So my dad was more of the black sheep of the family, kind of the outsider. And so my dad had struggles. My mother had struggles. They got married very young and were not equipped with their upbringing to be the parents that they needed to be.
How did they meet?
My mother was singing a solo for the singles ministry at their church in New Orleans. My dad was 9 years older. He had been fighting in the Korean War. He was a Air Force pilot, and came home for a leave, like a 10-day leave. My mother sang in Sunday school. My grandmother made my dad go to church on his leave. And so my dad went to the singles Sunday school, and my mother was the guest soloist. And he saw her and said, "This is the girl I'm going to marry." So my grandfather, both my grandfathers were friends, my father's father and my mother's father. And my father's father asked my mother's father, would it be okay if Jack asked Martha for a date?
Wow.
So my mother, when they met, my mother was 15, my dad was 24. She had never been on a date. And they instantly fell in love. So those 10 days of leave, they were inseparable for the 10 days.
Wow. So did they get married? How long was their courtship before they got married?
They dated for 2 years. They got married the night of her high school graduation.
Wow.
And about 6 weeks before their wedding, she never shared, none of her high school friends knew she was even dating my dad. So the night of their high school graduation, they had rehearsal the day before. My mother wasn't there. And all of her friends said, "Martha, where are you? Why weren't you at the ceremony, the rehearsal?" And she goes, "Well, I'm getting married tomorrow." So she never even shared with her friends that she was getting married. But she went to my grandmother about 6 weeks before the wedding and said, "I'm too young. I don't want to get married. I'm not ready." And my grandmother said, "You've already had your showers. It's too late. You need to get married." So my mother had just turned 17 a week before they got married. And my dad at that time was 26. And it was kind of doomed from the start, you know.
So tell me about growing up in a church and kind of concealing the dysfunction of the home life and just kind of what that looked like for you growing up.
Well, my father's parents were very active at their church, at the Baptist Church, Southern Baptist Church. My mother's parents as well. Both of my grandfathers were deacons. My dad taught Sunday school. My mother sang in the choir. My grandmother sang in the choir. My other grandfather was the church treasurer. So their marriage was almost an arranged Southern Baptist marriage. So when we were born, my brother, sister, and I, immediately we attended cradle roll, which we were 2 weeks old and already in the cradle, the newborn ministry, so that my mother could sing her solos. We always sat together on the second row on the right side of the sanctuary. We attended every single event at the church: Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, missions night, choir practice. Friday nights was family night. We lived at the church. There was the facade that we were the perfect Baptist family. And at home, our home life was in shambles. My mother was having affairs with anybody that looked her way. My dad was an alcoholic. And so it was very, very dysfunctional.
So was your dad an alcoholic? Was he drinking from the time you remember, or was there a specific?
My dad, my grandmother, his mother would pop over a lot, so we didn't have alcohol in our home. The only thing I remember as far as alcohol, we had rum extract and another bourbon extract or something that I thought was really
the
neat.
Christian way to get it into your desserts.
So we always tried to sample it, thought we were really cool having this taste of rum extract. But my dad would go out on the weekends. They would go to dinners, and he'd have business meetings. My dad was an architect, and so he was drinking away from the home, and he was always drinking. And somehow was able to have some coffee and sober up before he got to church. He was able to manipulate. He was very manipulative. He was able to have a front when he got to church, and looking back, I thought that nobody knew, but looking back, I know everybody knew. And I think they had so much respect for both sets of my grandparents that they just kind of
Looks
turn
the
a
other
blind
way.
eye.
Yeah. You say in the book too, you start going into what your weekends were like with your dad's mother and father, and can we dive into that a little bit more of exactly what that looked like when the weekend started, kind of what led up to that, with your mother always in her bedroom, always in bed, watching her soaps, and then, dad's at work and then comes home and doesn't really know, wants to be with the kids, but it's like he's trying to make her happy. Can we dive into that?
Yeah, when we were little, like toddler age, my sister and I, we had 2 sets of grandparents. They were always available to babysit on a whim. My mother always had complications of her deliveries, even though we had been delivered 2 and 4 years prior. She was always in bed, always watching soap operas, always reading magazines, and always too weak to take care of my sister and I. When my brother was born, I have a younger brother, she had a new lease on life having a boy, and she was very clear, it's different with a boy. I know how much he loves me. My son, we have a special connection. So both of my grandmothers would offer to take care of my sister and I. So the first 3-4 years of my life, I have very few, if any, memories with my mother. I never remember her reading a bedtime story. I never remember her tucking me in bed at night. I never remember her fixing me breakfast. In fact, I was learning to cook eggs and turn on the stove. I was like 4 and 5 years old. I mean, my sister and I kind of fended for ourselves unless we were with our grandmothers. So when I was 6, my father's parents lived very close to us. And my parents, what started, we would spend the night on occasion. What started, my grandparents would pick us up on Friday from school Friday afternoon, and we would not see our parents until Sunday at church service. We never heard from them on the weekends. We never talked to them. And my father's mother was a nurse. She grew up in the Depression. She grew up on the farm, very poor, and she believed that children should not have toys. Children should be seen and not heard, and children should learn to be humble servants, that a woman's place was in the home, having children, and we needed to be humble. So my grandmother did not believe, it was the 60s, 70s, but did not believe in fashionable clothes. She felt that we were more Christ-like if we dressed like hillbillies ready to feed the cows. She sent us to church. She took pride in being humble, and she would call herself just an old country woman, but she prided herself. I think she felt she was living her life through us, and that we could be these humble little girls, to be humble women. She was very cruel. We were starching sheets. We were flipping rugs. We were turning the house upside down. We were cleaning with bleach and ammonia when we were 5 and 6 years old. So while our friends were playing with Barbies and G.I. Joes, we were learning the proper way to iron a hospital bed sheet.
Well, because toys were very limited, and when you would go over, was it you were only allowed one? You only had limited toys. Is that correct?
we could not have toys at her house at all.
Okay.
She did not believe in toys. And I remember at church, she had a Sunday school class, and somebody had accidentally left a Barbie and Ken there. And I just was so excited about the Barbie and Ken. So I hid it. We'd go on Saturdays to get ready for Sunday school on Sunday mornings because we were always at church.
I remember those days.
Yeah, and I hid the Barbie and Ken. And it wasn't the real Barbie and Ken. It was like a knockoff plastic, but I didn't care. Well, I hid him in a little cubby behind something. And So I could had my special place for the little plastic Barbie and Ken.
I love that.
And she found them and threw them out. So she felt like that was idle time. And, we were not allowed to watch cartoons. We were not allowed to play board games or card games. We were to serve or we were to work.
I have a question. Was that more because she felt like those activities, was it the work part, or was it like it's not honoring God if you're playing a card game or if you're playing Barbies, you're not serving, therefore you're not serving the Lord?
I think she saw it as serving, that
Okay.
you have to work. I think she saw that, some people believe that works get you into heaven.
Yes.
And I never saw her read the Bible. I know
Okay.
she loved church. We were always at church, but the only time we prayed was right before a meal. I never saw her just say, you know what, let's pray about this person. She didn't do that. It was all about works. And so in her mind, I think that was it was works that would get her into heaven. And she never sat and rested and enjoyed life. She was always working.
And probably by having the grandchildren and being in your charge, she's also helping you get to heaven, or you do your part of the works. So that was also on her. That makes sense. So how many years were you at your father's father's mother and father's house on the weekends?
Well, and let me explain this. My mother's parents moved to Dallas. My mother's father was given a raise or a job promotion at Texaco, and so they moved to Dallas.
Okay.
So we still saw them during the summer or sometimes holidays, but primarily for 6 years, we spent every weekend at my grandparents'. We never heard from my parents on the weekends. I never heard from them on a Saturday night, on a Friday night. And it was almost like we lived two different lives. We lived, when we were at home, my mother's big expression was, get out of my hair. And so we never were home. She did not want us inside. She did not want us messing up the house. So Monday through Thursday, if we weren't at church, we were roaming the streets of New Orleans. We would gather 7 cents and take the streetcar, and my sister and I would go to the French Quarter and walk around and look at the boats. We'd look at the people. We'd window shop at the stores on Canal Street, which was like the major street. But here we are, these two little girls on the streetcar roaming New Orleans. And then on Fridays, our life was almost like... it was so controlled. It was just totally opposite of our weekday life, was our weekend life.
How old were you when you were roaming the streets? When did that start? Weren't you 6?
6. I was 6 years old. And so I was able to, I knew the streets of New Orleans like a taxi cab
Well, it's not like you got in trouble and you got into
No.
things. You were just allowed to be gone.
And
you
explore,
needed to be gone.
And one thing I write about in the book, I grew up Baptist. I attend a Baptist church and I love it. I sing in the choir now. But at that time, I saw the church is almost like a prison. It was not fun for me. It wasn't community for me because I felt like our family was lying. I felt like we were living a lie to the congregation. My dad would use this expression, mum's the word. So we were not able to, we had to pretend everything was perfect going on at our home. But I had lots of friends growing up in New Orleans. Most of my friends were Catholic. And I remember one day, Hope, my sister, and I took the streetcar, and we heard a family talking on the streetcar about the St. Louis Cathedral, which is one of the oldest, grandest Catholic cathedrals in the country.
Which is a visitation destination, right, in New Orleans.
It is. It's beautiful. It's on Jackson Square. And so Hope and I followed these tourists. We walked about half a block away because we were like, let's go take a look at this St. Louis. We didn't know what it was. But just the reverence and the peace. And I remember the smells of the anise, of the incense that the priest used. It had such a calming effect on me. And I remember seeing people are just praying just because they want to pray. They're not praying before they eat. And I couldn't make that correlation. But I was like, this is what I want. This is the way a church should be. This is the way community should be, not what I have on the weekends on Sunday. So that was just one of my little trips on the streetcar, but it was just filled with we did such wonderful things, and it was an escape from the dysfunction.
Well, and what I love too about, and I think it's in that same chapter that you talk about you and Hope being on the streetcar and then going into the church, is that you would go to different hotels and different places and gather the brochures. And then when you would try to talk to people, and you knew who was the tourist and who wasn't. And so you would talk to people and kind of let them know where they should go. And you were kind of a tour guide because you knew you knew the city.
Well, and we were so poor, and I was always trying to wait. I was an entrepreneur before I knew what it was. And I have a business now, and we've been very blessed, and it's successful. I'm very fortunate of that. But I always had that entrepreneurial spirit. Even when I was little, I would try to find ways to make money. And so we'd gather these brochures and say we were tour guides, and people would give us 20 cents or a quarter, and we just thought, oh, wow, this is great. I would even, Tulane at the time, their football games, we lived right near Tulane Stadium. Oh. And some of the residents that lived close by would actually let people park cars in their yard and charge them $5 or whatever. So I would always ride my bike over and offer to help gear the cars in, and they'd give me 50 cents or 25 cents. And I would just think it was the neatest thing. So I was always trying to find ways to make money and win prizes. It's just kind of my thing.
It also got you away from the house, and it got you, were you allowed to do, when you were at your grandmother and grandfather's house, you were not allowed to go, I mean, you couldn't really explore. You couldn't go anywhere. You were under her charge.
We could not go anywhere.
From Friday until Sunday. And then I know in the book too, you had mentioned about that y'all would go on, you'd go out to eat after church. And that was kind of, no matter what the topic was, or if it always went back to your mother, or how every conversation always went back about your mother, it was still cherished time for you because you were with your family, and it was a family unit.
I was actually with my parents. And my mother, I've worked with a psychologist for years, and the psychologist has told me, I haven't really shared a lot about my mother, other than she was a very special person. She was so gifted at music, at the piano. She could listen to a stanza of a song and be able to play it like a concert pianist 5 minutes later. She was amazingly gifted. I think now she would have probably been diagnosed as autistic. Okay. She was very self-absorbed. She was not able to empathize. She had no patience for children. She should never have. I'm grateful she's my mother. That's the only mother I know. But she did not have the tools to be a mother. And as an adult, I now realize that, she was very narcissistic. And I know she did the best she could. That was just her, but, the weekends that we were with our grandparents, and my grandmother, we haven't talked about this, was very abusive to us, to my brother and sister and I. It took me years to be able to even discuss some of the things that my grandmother did. And, but I know in my mother's, if my mother knew, if she was a healthy, normal woman, she would not have allowed her children to be in that type of environment. it took me years of therapy and years of prayer, and I had to learn to forgive my mother. It took years to do that.
When was the point where you came to forgiveness for your grandmother? Because
it was pretty recent. It took a long time, and it wasn't until my grandmother's funeral. She was a pedophile, and it wasn't until my grandmother's funeral that my brother and my sister and I actually even talked about it. It was the day of her funeral. I couldn't talk to anybody about it. I couldn't even talk to my own husband about it. It was just something you didn't talk about. And even though I'd heard sexual abuse, children suffer from abuse, it still did not register. And I think that was God protecting me too. There are a lot of memories that I still don't want to open up. There are things that I just don't want to go there. But all I can say is I have to forgive. You know, I had a doctor tell me several years ago, Joe, if you don't forgive, it's going to eat you up inside. And doing research on my grandmother, my father's mother, she had a very difficult life. And I think things happened to her, and things were never addressed. And had she had the tools that we have today, I just think her life could have been different. My father's life could have been different. But where I'm different is I say enough. I say stop. I say, you know what, this is not normal.
Which you said that when you were
I did.
9?
When I was 10,
okay.
I confronted her.
Okay.
And it's in my book. I tell the story about it. But I confront her, and
you said it was like the Holy Spirit just gave you, the Lord gave you the empowerment and the strength to say, no, don't.
Well, and backing up, and it's in the book, I do go to my mother when I'm 6 or 7 to tell her some things that my grandmother has done, and my mother laughed it off.
And said it was normal.
Said
that's what grandparents do.
And any mother that's normal would know. They would step in and say, you're not going over there. You know, what's going on here? Even in the 60s when it wasn't something that was talked about.
Because you dreaded it.
I dreaded it.
But the three of you dreaded it. But you dreaded it. You dreaded going over there every weekend. And your parents knew that. But it was to a point in their marriage and to where your mother was mentally at that time too. And your father, I think, trying to keep her happy. And, you know, because in that time in a Christian home, you don't divorce, like there's no, the D word doesn't exist. You figure it out and make it work. And that's what your parents, I think, from an outside person reading the book, is trying to, you know, he's trying to keep that together. And so you just make it work. And no matter what, it's kind of almost, and even I think in the church sometimes, and maybe not as much anymore, because I think, and as I see, and as I'm, you know, just growing in the Lord more, is that it's more acceptable and more, I guess, quote unquote, acceptable and more talked about, abuse and things like that, and forgiveness and healing. But at that time in your life when you were younger, and even growing up through that and not being able to share that until her funeral, and when you're a successful, wonderful adult that loves the Lord, which is a whole other topic we're going to get into in a future podcast, but just being able to say, like, we don't want to go over there and we're so afraid, it was never heard. So you basically didn't feel like you were heard.
No, and I was terrified. I would complain of stomach aches. I would use every excuse, and we always had to go. And I remember I'd say, I'm so anxious, grandmother. And she'd say, oh, you're not anxious. Don't say you're anxious. That, you know, a child is not anxious. And so looking back, all the signs were there that something was going on. people had to have been either so oblivious, or they knew my grandparents' role at the church, and so they just decided just not to say anything. And that's where now, just as a Christian, as a mom, now a grandmother, I feel like I have these special goggles. They're invisible goggles. So if I see somebody, I think, you know what, they are hurting, and I can just tell. I may not do anything. I may just stop the car and start praying and just say, Lord, bless that person, whatever. Sometimes I'll see a kid walking up the street and you can tell they're late for school. And I think, you know what, maybe his mother didn't wake him up, or maybe his mother's out all night and he's been by himself. You never know.
You never know.
I mean, my brother and I were by ourselves the majority of high school. And that we're going to get to that. But, you just never know what walk somebody is in at that time. And so that's the whole meaning of the lemon tree, is how can we make a difference when others are falling short? And give me the vision, give me the tools to see this person is needing just a little extra love today. And so that's just my message.
Which is amazing, Joe, because honestly, for you, and I can't wait to go home tonight and keep reading the book, because it puts you there how you write. It really puts you in the situations. I mean, reading the chapter about your grandmother, well, the multiple chapters, but where you finally said no, and then it wasn't ever addressed. It was just like it didn't happen. And so speaking to that, when did you know during that time, when did you know that things were not right?
I think I knew that when I went to my other grandmother's house, those things did not happen. And she used the excuse as being a nurse. And so nurses needed to examine children. But even my pediatrician didn't do that. My pediatrician's nurse didn't do that. So I think it was when the day I confronted her, she had just smarted off at me one too many times, scolded me. And I think I'm a very outspoken person. My sister and brother are more the peacemakers. I was always the more outspoken one. And I just think it was a particular day. And I will say I prayed in a childlike faith. I prayed, Lord, take me away from this, because I hated being at her house. I hated it. And I think it was the Lord that gave me the strength to just say enough is enough. And I remember that particular day, she walked away and she never tried anything again. And I think at that time too, she knew I had something on her. And so I think maybe that was just the tool. She was afraid of me. She was afraid of what I was going to say.
The tables had turned at that point.
The tables had turned. And so our relationship was different after that. But I had a secret on her, and she could not risk tarnishing her reputation at church.
That exposure would ruin everything that she was fake enough to portray and get away with for all those years. That's just incredible. And I also think too, and we had spoken to this a little while ago, that I really feel like this book is very much from the Lord. And even if he allowed all of those things, and not everything's going to be written down. I mean, there's, again, like you just said, there's things that you don't want to open. And I do believe that the Lord does protect children, and either blocks it or saves it for a time when he knows we can handle things. But just even reading to where I am, and I do want to talk about your baptism too, but even reading up to that point, up to where I am now, just seeing you still were never, you did not lash out at your grandmother. You were not disrespectful. You were not, and and not necessarily like, not saying you were compliant, but you held it in a way to where you held it and you took it until you weren't going to take it anymore. And then it was over. And the scars are there, and they're always going to be there because scars mean healing. And I really feel like this is going to touch people, and I pray that it will, and I know it will, because if you do see things that are amiss, if you have a child, and I pray that if the Lord ever blesses me with children, that I will like look for those signs and just say, if somebody hates going somewhere, if a child is so reluctant and doesn't want to do something, there's a reason. And like we spoke about, there's times where kids, act out and just because they want their way. But we can discern, when that does happen. And if that can protect, one child from further abuse or convict an abuser that this isn't right and this isn't of the Lord, as much as you go to church and as well as you play church, that's not of the Lord. And what I find so wonderful and so what a blessing it is that you have your relationship with the Lord. And I think it's stronger now than ever. I have not had the blessing of knowing you for more than 5 years, 6 years. But even knowing in that time, I mean, you truly seek the Lord through all of this. And so at what point a couple years ago, because I think, and I'd mentioned this too, because I didn't really know how many years and what a process it is to go through things to then be able to write a memoir of courage. When did that come to you? Like, when did the Lord put it on your heart? Hey, you really need to get this on paper. Like,
well, I called myself a church hopper. So when I knew it was important for a family to be at church, for children to be at church. And so we would attend churches, but I would just attend long enough. The kids would do a great program, or there would be an event or something, until I started to get to know people. And then somebody might look at me the wrong way, and we'd go to another church. So I probably, with my poor kids, their childhood, we probably went to 6 or 8 churches. And it was me. I did not want people to know the real me. I didn't feel that I was worthy. I didn't feel, and I didn't trust the church either. But it was about 6 years ago. We went to church, and there was a song that the choir sang at church. And I heard the song, and the words were, "No more night, no more pain, no more suffering." And it was if the Lord was saying, "No more, Joe. You have been through enough. Trust me. I'm yours. I'm here. Trust me. You. There's no reason for you to be in pain anymore." And something just convicted me. I remember I heard this song and I started crying. You were in the choir.
Love that
I started
song.
crying. I could not stop for 5 days. I thought I was having a nervous breakdown. So that was when I got a Christian. I found a counselor who's amazing. And it was a turning point for me that it's not about one person, about these priests in the Catholic Church. It's not all priests, but there may be a handful of priests that have done things, and it gives the whole Catholic Church a bad name. In my grandmother, if they had known my grandmother was doing those things, they would not have had her in the position she was in. And I can't blame the church. She was evil. Now they do background checks, and there would be ways to protect little children. Back in the 60s, you just trusted. And so I had to learn to trust. So it was about 6 years ago. I kind of shared my story in a Bible study, and I wound up giving my testimony, wound up giving it to choir, and then gave it to a women's group. And then just thought, you know what, this story needs to be on paper. And so I started writing my book. It has taken me 3 years to write the book, and I've had to start and stop, put it down for a while, because drumming up a lot of those memories was very painful for me. So it's not, and I'd find myself, if I was writing a lot, I would get really down and thinking back to some of that stuff. So I had to give myself breaks as I wrote. And doing the research, most memoir writers with difficult stories, it takes them a while to get that story across.
Well, during that time, Joe, that you were writing that, your father passed away, and then your mother passed away the following year. And so tell me about that. Like, while you were writing the book and going through that, what was that like for you?
It was difficult because I was writing the book while my dad was on his final journey. We knew that he was on hospice. My sister and I, he'd been an alcoholic for years, and he wanted to live with either my sister or I, which was not going to work. But we did make the decision together that we would get him off alcohol. And so we did our own home detox with the help of a doctor and got him completely off alcohol. We were able to talk to him about some tough stories and talk to him about what happened in the past. And I do believe my dad was remorseful, and he apologized. And if he could have been a stronger person, had he not have the upbringing that he did with his mother, he was always trying to prove to her that he was bigger than she said he was. So he had to be the big shot. He had to be the big man on campus. And I think he was living such a facade that he couldn't step back and look at his precious family and his children and what he had been blessed with. But he was so controlled by not living up to his parents' expectations that he therefore failed as a parent.
Because the other siblings in his family and his family members were doctors, and that was just not his path. And his mother always kind of shunned him for that. Is that accurate?
She did. She wanted him in medicine. My grandmother was a nurse. My uncle was a doctor. My grandfather was an X-ray technician. So all they talked about was medicine. And
but he knew you were right. He knew you were writing the book.
Yeah,
and
he knew
you had
I was
told
writing
him,
the book.
You know,
Right.
some of those hard things that were in the book, and that he wasn't aware of, or maybe blocked himself and didn't know he was aware of it, and things like that because of maybe his own childhood. Because I just know, and it's such a learning process for me too, being able to have the privilege and honor of reading your book, first of all, which is, I mean, it's a huge blessing
Thank
to be able to read it, because it's another window. It is the window into who you are and who God's brought you to become, which is a huge deal. And when I had the privilege and honor to be with Jack for a little bit of time, that I got to be with him when you and I first had started together, he always would say, "My children are so wonderful. Don't I have the best children? They take care of me. They love me." And he would go on, and you would tell me, yes, that's great but they're, that's not all there is to it. And being able to see his remorse and see that he truly did, from an outsider, again, from what I saw, was that he was coming to the place, and maybe had been at the place, of true understanding of the value of his children. And I pray that was the case. But so when your dad passed, I know you're writing, you're going through that, and that was kind of a difficult journey. Tell me about when your mom passed away.
It was the same. My mother remarried when I was in high school. Once she remarried, I mean, as little as we saw her growing up, we saw even less when she remarried. Her husband had 3 children. She had the 3 of us, and they just kind of ran off together. They left their responsibilities of family. I rarely saw my mother. And so once I became an adult and started a family, she got a little more involved in my life. Not a whole lot. She never babysat. She'd call me and we'd talk. And if she came to Dallas, we'd go to dinner or go to lunch or whatever. Never had a real role in my children's lives. But I think when she moved here, we got her here. She was put on hospice and we brought her here. I just looked at her life. And I feel like we all have a purpose. I feel God designs every single person on this earth. We all have a purpose. And we're all to honor that purpose and follow that purpose. And if we don't, our life ricochets. My mother had this she was a genius at music, at playing, at singing. And she threw it all away for a man. And, left her family, and I think she thought the grass would be greener, and all she found was emptiness and loneliness, and just didn't fulfill her purpose. And it was just heartbreaking to see her die and alone. And it was just a lesson on how important it is to give back, to serve, to be good to your family, to be good to others. It was just a message that we are to love.
Yeah. Well, and I know what I admire too about you. And again, learning all these things about childhood and just growing up, and not just childhood, but, growing up years and adulthood, is that the way that you still honored your mother and served her and cared for her by going to Louisiana and bringing her back and caring for her while she was on hospice. You were with her. You were right there with her, honoring her until the end. And that is such an inspiration to me. And I really, truly, all of you that are listening and watching, I really hope that when you read the book and Joe's story about what happened and just everything that happened, you honored your mother. You still honored your father, even though it was so heartbreaking and so much stuff. But I know the whole story and the whole point of Lemon Tree and why God has allowed all of this to happen so that the healing can come is to bring him honor and glory, and so that you can be that beacon and you can be the lemon tree for other people. And even before this book, Joe, you are the lemon tree to people. I said I wasn't going to get emotional, but it's going to be so helpful. It really is. And I know that on the next couple of podcasts, so excited, we're actually going to dive in a little bit more to when your mother left, her suicide attempt, to just kind of keep going, because if you'll have me back,
Yes.
I'm very
thank you. And
I
you've
want to
made it so
keep going with I want everybody to hear your heart before they have the opportunity and the privilege to read the book, so that when people get to read it and just read your life and your testimony of God's goodness, they'll know your journey, and they'll already have a little glimpse into it. So I appreciate just the opportunity to be able to be here with you. This is a blessing.
Thank you, Krista. And thank you. I knew I needed to have somebody interview me, and I just thought about it. I thought, Chris is the perfect person.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. And we'll be back
I'm very
again
excited.
and continue going. And I'm really excited for people to read my book and share my story, and hope it's a blessing to others.
It will.
Thank you for joining us on the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast, hosted by author Joe Alsh. You can find more information on Joe's beginnings and the Lemon Tree at thelemontreebook.com.